Okay, so just a brief overview of lithium batteries. These are all the rage this year, and there are some serious benefits to lithium, but there are also some things you need to consider when you're considering putting them in a vehicle or in an off-grid application. So I started out with some pretty expensive AGM lead acid batteries on my off-grid system at home, and I wasn't surprised after a couple of years they started to dwindle a little bit under any kind of heavy demand. So if you put on a large inverter like a 3 kVA combi unit, you'd only get a few minutes before the battery voltage dropped to a point where the inverter shut down. And the reason for that is that lead acid battery performance does drop fairly rapidly. Even if they're looked after, there's only so many times you can discharge and recharge a lead acid battery, and all the time the capacity is draining as well. And then there's just general things like sulfation affecting the ability to accept charge and also discharge. So why do we want to consider an alternative technology? Just to answer very briefly though, what the objection to lithium has been in the past, it was always cost. It was just way too expensive, and it was almost like a millionaire product for super yachts. But it's much more affordable now, although you do need to take care to buy from a reputable distributor, because there is an awful lot of pretty dangerous stuff out there as well. But basically, what I found with lithium was that while everybody talks about the weight saving and the greater usable capacity, by which point actually just take care of people saying that you can use double the amount of stored energy. You can, but it does affect the number of times that you can cycle that battery. So if we're comparing like for like, for example, where you have 50% discharge rule on lead acid batteries, on a lithium, the greatest depth of discharge would be about 80%. So get it down to 20% left, and you'll get the most cycles out of it, sort of compared to performance and run times on your equipment. So basically, yes, you do have about 30% more usable capacity, less weight in the vehicle, sometimes fewer batteries as well. And this is because lithium batteries tend to operate at a slightly higher voltage than lead acid and maintain that voltage for longer. And the effect that that has is your equipment, which will be voltage sensitive, so when it gets down to a given voltage, for example 10.6 on most inverters, will shut down. Whereas with a lithium battery, and a lead acid battery will get you down to that level pretty quickly under a heavy load. With a lithium battery, that voltage will stay above 12 volts nearly all the way through the discharge. So you can use a lot more of that capacity without your equipment shutting down. And the effect of that for me has been that although on paper you may have 30% more usable capacity, in practice I see my equipment lasting several times longer on lithium batteries of the same capacity as they do on lead acid batteries. And it really is a bit of a no-brainer if you can afford lithium to use it in mobile and off-grid applications. There are some drawbacks that you need to consider though. You can't charge a lithium battery when the core temperature is below zero, and in some cases below 5 degrees. I'm not too au fait on why. I think it's to do with crystals being grown inside, which can short circuit it and create a dangerous situation. So you must ensure that, first of all, the battery is installed in such a way that it's kept warm, or at least above zero. And you can do that with insulation, but it's also a good idea to think about heat sources for it. For example, maybe a 12-volt heating element, or a heat mat like a Rivarium reptile mat, for example. An alternative would be to buy a battery with a heating element in it. And if you want details of that, drop me a line and I can point you in the direction of a retailer for those. The alternative, again, is that you make sure that the battery can't be charged in sub-zero temperatures by fitting additional equipment in your charging circuits. So, for example, temperature sensitive solar charge controllers. Again, Victron offers products which can be put together to achieve that, and we can certainly help you do that. Basically though, do you want your battery bank to not be charged when it's cold? So for example, do you want to live off grid but have no energy during the winter because your batteries are stored in the shed and it gets cold in there? You don't. Your solar panels, for example, would be producing very high output on a bright, clear, cold day. That's when solar panels are at their best. And if your batteries are, as it were, switched off because you don't want to charge them when they're cold, then that's a terrible waste, not to mention inconvenient. So think about heating your battery. The other thing to consider is that they have a limited amps discharge value and also a limited amps recharge value. So a lot of lithium batteries on the market today have an inbuilt BMS, a battery management system, and that will only carry so many amps across it. So whereas some lead acid batteries can have very high amps leaving them, with a lithium battery, you have to think about adding up the amps in a bank, for example, by paralleling your batteries in order to run your equipment. So, for example, if you have a 100 amp discharge limited battery and you want to run a 2400 watt inverter, your discharge rate would be 200 amps, and therefore you need to fit 2 batteries in parallel in order to be able to deliver that without the BMS shutting the battery down. So there is that sort of complication to it as well. There are some other things to consider with lithium batteries. One of them is that you can't charge it using an alternator directly from a vehicle. So the reason for that is there's very low resistance in a lithium battery, and the alternator can actually output and warm up a lot quicker than the fan is able to spin to cool it. So in other words, your alternator overheats and burns out if you try and charge a lithium battery directly off it, unless you have a super high quality alternator and some decent regulation fitted to it. So what you need to consider when you're buying a lithium battery for a vehicle is a battery to battery charger. And you may have one of these anyway on a Euro 6 type vehicle with a smart alternator, because VSRs, voltage sensitive relays, don't really work in modern vehicles anymore because of the voltage that the alternator rests at. So if you don't, so you'll often have a battery to battery charger fitted, but if you don't, you will need one for a lithium battery bank fitted for running domestic loads on the vehicle. And the last thing to consider with lithium, and it's back to the amps limitations, not all lithium batteries can be used to start a vehicle. So don't plan on using your lithium battery bank to jump start your vehicle. It might work, it might not. It's probably not a good idea to try and find out. So there you go, lithium batteries, they're down in price, they'll run your gear a lot longer, they'll give you thousands more cycles than a lead acid, so although they're more expensive up front, they will save you money in the long run, and they'll also free you up from worrying about the quality of charge going on your batteries on a daily basis. They are good for opportunity charging. They don't need to be fully recharged daily like a lead acid battery should be. They'll still give you great performance, and I think if you invest in them, by the time they do get to a point where they're no longer running your equipment for long enough, you'll certainly feel that you had your money's worth.